Seches Yevamos Daf Ayin Dalid contains two sugyas. The first is the Gemara's continued search for a proof to the answer to its question: what is the halacha about an oral? Someone who doesn't have a bris milah, is he allowed to eat Meister Sheni or not? The Gemara will continue finding a number of proofs on that topic and then show us the opinion of the Amora Rabbi Yitzchak. The Gemara will reject a lot of the proofs. Along the way, the Gemara will compare the halachos of four things: Truma, Karban Pesach, Kachim, and Meiser. Who is allowed to eat or use these things? And the second half of the daf will be devoted to the sugya of a tamei eating truma. What is the source of the halacha that a tamei person is not allowed to eat truma? I will have three levels of tumah. I need to find a source for each of them. So let's begin the Gemara. The Gemara wants to know, what is the halacha? Is a person who does not have a bris milah, who is called an oral, is he allowed to eat from meiser sheni or not? So the Gemara first brings a brisa. As a proof, the Brisa says somebody who has tzitzin hama'akmin, somebody who has strips of skin that make his milah puzzle, so he counts as an aral. So he's not allowed to eat not truma, not pesach, and not kachim. So, and he's also not allowed to eat meiser. So you have four things on the list: truma, pesach, kachim, meiser. So you see clearly he's not allowed to eat meiser because he doesn't have a proper bris milah. So the Gemara says, how do you know that this meiser means meiser sheni? Maybe it's talking about meiser behema. Meiser behema is one out of every 10 animals which is meant to be brought as a carbon. So the Gemara says meiser behema. Meiser behema is kachim. We said kachim on the list. Why would meiser be referring to the same thing as kachim? So the Gemara says, well, it says Pesach on the list, and Pesach is also Kachim. We don't have a problem listing Kachim and Pesach separately, so we could also list Meiser and be referring to Meiser Behema and list it separately from Kachim. It's a type of Kachim specifically. So the Gemara says, no, that doesn't make sense. We had to list Pesach and Kachim separately because if we only listed Pesach and not Kachim, I would think that that only carbon Pesach is also for an oral to eat, but not other karbanos, because the Torah specifically says, by a carbon Pesach v'chol oral lo yochaba. We would not know that that's true for other karbanos. And if I would have only said kachim and not Pesach, I would have said that kachim means Pesach. It's referring to that which the Torah mentioned. Therefore, I have to say both Pesach and Kachim separately. But the word Kachim should include Meiser Behema. There's no reason that Meiser Behema should be different than any other Karbanos. So the Gemara therefore needs another answer to reject this proof. The Gemara says that when it says Meiser, it's not referring not to Meiser Sheni and not to Meiser Behema, it's referring to Meiser Rishon. Meiser Rishon is the Meiser that's taken off every crop and given to the Levi. So the Gemara says this is the opinion of Rabbi Meir, who holds that Yisrael is not allowed to eat Meiser Rishon. Since Rabbi Meir holds that special strict halacha about Meiser Rishon, he also holds that an oral is not allowed to eat Meiser Rishon. However, most Tanaim hold that a Yisrael is allowed to eat Meiser Rishon, and therefore they would also hold that a oral is allowed to eat Meiser Rishon. Either way, it doesn't say anything about Meiser Rishon or Meiser Sheni. According to most opinions here, it doesn't say whether it's Aser or not. Says Umar, okay, we'll try another proof, and that's a brisa quoted by Reb Chia bar Rav Midifti. It says that an oral is also to eat two meisers. Both meisers are aser. So probably one is talking about meiser of grain, and one is talking about meiser of behema, and you see that all meiser grains are therefore aser for a oral to eat. So the Umar says, no, two meisers here are meiser behema and meiser rishon, not Meiser Sheni. And again, this is the opinion of Rabbi Meir, holds that Meiser Rishon is also for a Yisrael to eat. Where says, okay, I'll give you a third proof, and that's the Brisa, which compares three different things. It compares Meiser, Truma, and Para Aduma, and it shows for each of these things, there's one that is Aser and two that are Mutter in a number of halachos. Now, three different things, and each one of these three is Aser, and the other two are Mutter. And listed as follows. In Onain, Meiser is Aser, and Onain is not allowed to eat Meiser. He's allowed to eat Truma, and he's allowed to do Para Aduma. Tvul Yom, that's somebody who was Tameh, went to the mikvah, has to wait for the sun to set before his Tahara is complete. He's allowed to eat Meiser and Para, but he's not allowed to, and he's allowed to eat Meiser and allowed to do Hazaz Para, but he's not allowed to eat Truma. Somebody who's in Mechusar Kippurim, that's somebody who went to the mikvah, sun came down, but he still needs to bring a carbon. We'll discuss this more at length later. Some types of tumah don't come off until after tefillah, after the sun sets, and after bringing a carbon the next day. So somebody who's in that status, he's waiting for his carbon, he is usher to do anything to do with paraduma. Paraduma has a special halacha that a tvul yom, and somebody who's waiting for the sun to set, is allowed to deal with a paraduma, but somebody who's waiting for a carbon to be brought, he's not allowed to. However, Mechusar Kippurim is allowed to eat truma and meiser. Now, this is a brisa. Conspicuously left off the list is an aral, which fits into this also. An aral we already said is allowed to do hazas paraduma. That's specifically mentioned. We know that an aral is not allowed to eat truma. Why don't we say that an aral is allowed to eat meiser? And therefore you'll have the same setup. You'll have that it's usher and truma, but it's mutter in two things. It's mutter in para and meiser. Obviously the reason must be because it's usher and meiser. And therefore you don't have the setup of here where it's mutter in two things and usher in one of these three things. So there you have a proof that aral is usher to eat meiser. Gemara is not a good proof. It could be that really the aral is mutter to eat meiser, but it's still not considered something which is usher in one thing and mutter in two, because this Tana actually holds that an aral is not allowed to deal with paraduma. And we've seen earlier that he is allowed to. This Tana disagrees. This is the opinion of Rabbi Akiva. And Rabbi Akiva says that the word ish, the phrase ish, that is written in the beginning of the psukim describing the halachos of a tamei person is to include an aral. An aral counts as a tamei person. Therefore, according to Rabbi Akiva, an aral and a tamei have the same halachos, and an aral would not be allowed to deal with paraduma. Says the Gemara, we saw earlier that you are allowed to, but we saw an Amora say that. Where do you see a Tana that says that? If you're saying that Rabbi Akiva holds that an aral can't deal with paraduma, who's the Tana that holds that a aral is allowed to deal with paraduma? So the Gemara says we have a brisa. The brisa quotes two opinions, the Tana Kama and Rabbi Yosef Habavli. That Tana Kama, that's the one. Rabbi Yosef Habavli holds like Rabbi Akiva, but the Tana Kama says that an aral is allowed to deal with paraduma. Let's see the brisa. The brisa says that in Onain, everyone agrees that an onain is allowed to deal with paraduma. An onain is allowed to burn paraduma. Mechusar Kippurim, that is a machlokes. The Tana Kama says that an onain, that a Mechusar Kippurim is allowed to burn the paraduma, and Rabbi Yosef Habavli says that he is not. And the fact that Rabbi Yosef Habavli holds that a Mechusar Kippurim is usher in a paraduma, the Gemara wants to say it's likely that he also argues about an aral. He also says that an aral is also, logically, he would also say that an aral is also not allowed to deal with paraduma. If a Mechusar Kippurim can't, then he would hold the same thing about an aral. He's stricter than this Tana, but the Tana himself should hold that an aral is mutter. That's how the Gemara wants to set it up. Alright, now the Gemara returns to the question of what is halacha of an aral as far as meiser. The Gemara says the Amar of Yitzchak holds that an aral is not allowed to eat meiser. Where do you see that? So the Gemara says that Rabbi Yitzchak has a drasha connecting meiser and korban pesach. Explicitly, the Torah tells us that a korban pesach is not allowed to be eaten by an aral, so meiser is connected to that, can also not be eaten by an aral. What's the drasha? So the Gemara says it's from the word mimenu. The word mimenu appears in the description of korban Pesach. It actually appears 3 times in the description of korban Pesach. It says "L'tochel mimenu na v'shal b'mayim kim tzliyesh al rosha akar av al kerbov l'sasiru mimenu ad boker v'nosir mimenu ad boker b'yish tisrafu." It also appears 3 times in Vida Meisers. V'chalte b'ayni mimenu le'ba'arti mimenu b'tamei le'nasati mimenu le'meis. So there you have mimenu 3 times. That connects the 2. And you therefore learn the halacha that an aral can eat from Pesach to Meiser. Says the Gemara, it's got to be that this mimenu is extra. You cannot have a drasha from one to the other, from Pesach to Meiser, just with Gzeir Shava, because I can say that it's logical that the Isser should apply by Korban Pesach and shouldn't apply anywhere else. Pesach is a much stricter halacha than Meiser. Pesach has the halachas of Pigul, Noser, and Tameh that Meiser does not have. It says Gemara, yes, it is extra. All right, says Gemara, which one's extra? Where do you see it as extra? So the Gemara quotes Rava, quoting Rav Yitzchak, who says that the 3 mimenus, one of them is extra, and it's used as follows. One mimenu is to tell me that the actual halachas of korban Pesach itself, it's not extra. It says "Al-Teichlim mimenu na." It's referring to the korban. You have to say mimenu at least one time. The second one is extra, and it's used from Gzeir Shava. The third one is where it says at the end it says Leisasiru mimenu ad boker v'hanosim mimenu ad boker be'esh tisreifu. So where it says v'hanosim mimenu ad boker be'esh tisreifu, what is that pasuk teaching me? That's a machlokes. According to each one, you have a different use here. According to one, it's teaching me that nosar, which is a lav, you're not supposed to leave karbonos over after the time. So it's teaching me that if you do, you have to burn it, turning that lav into what's called a lav hanite glasay. It's a lav that if you violate the lav, you fix it by doing the assay of burning it, and that makes it something that you don't get malchus for. It's a whole sugya in Psachim. Now, the other opinion is that where it says v'hanosim yimenu ad boker b'eish tisrofa, the key point here is that it says ad boker to tell you that you have an ad boker, you have another morning to burn it. You don't burn it on the morning which becomes nosar, which is the day of Pesach itself. You don't burn nosar on Yom Tov. You have to wait until Chol Hamoed. You have to wait until the next boker to burn it. So that's two opinions as to what this pasuk is teaching me. Either one says the word mimenu to be included in that halacha. Because it's teaching an extra halacha, so it says the word mimenu to stress that halacha. Okay, so according to what we've learned, there's an extra mimenu in Pesach, and that's what's used for this drasha, connecting it to Meiser. Says the Gemara, but where do you have a mimenu that's extra in Meiser? In Meiser, all three mimenus are needed. The Gemara explains what the three mimenus are for. The Gemara says one is l'gufe, one is needed for the pasuk to make sense. The second one is to teach me the halacha of Rabbi Avo that it's permitted to burn tamei oil of truma. That is, in Meiser it says, I didn't burn it when it was tamei, lo bi'arti mimenu b'tuma, but it's only mimenu, it's only here in Meiser that I didn't burn b'tuma, but truma I am allowed to burn b'tuma. That's the second mimenu. And the third one is halacha of Rish Lakish, that it's mutter to rub tamei meiser oil on your skin. Where do you see that? That's because it says I didn't give it to the dead. That means that there's something that I can't do to the dead that I am allowed to do to the living. What's that referring to? That's referring to tamei oil, which I'm not allowed to give it to the dead. I'm not allowed to rub it on the dead, but I am allowed to do it to the living. How do you know it's referring to rubbing oil? The Gemara says, well, you can't. What else is it referring to? You can't give the dead to drink. So it's got to be that there's something which you're allowed, the same activity is permitted to the living and forbidden to the dead. What is that? So it's got to be rubbing. That's something you can do to both the living and the dead. Says Gemara, no, maybe it's not what it means. Maybe it's referring to using meiser and making clothing out of it, or selling it and redeeming it and making clothing out of its value. So how do you know that that's not what it means? And the dead require clothing as well. They require shrouds, tachrichim, all those things. So Gemara says, no, that can't be what it means. It can't be that you're selling it and using the money for something else. It's got to be, when we're saying that there's some activity that's permitted for the living and not for the dead, that has to be the actual use of the meiser itself. How do you know that? Because it says mimenu. Mimenu means from the thing itself. So Gemara, I'll show you another way that it's got to be from the thing itself, because it's got to be similar to achila. We say the vidui meises, we say like chaltu mimenu, or nesati mimenu. Just like the achila is eating it, the nasati lemeis is referring to doing something with it itself. Now, we're stuck now with a problem though, because all three mimenos and meiser are needed, and we have a rule that you cannot learn gzeira shava from one thing to another. In this case, it would be from carbon pesach to meiser, unless it's extra on both ends. If you have a reason to ask a kasha on the hakish, a reason to show that you shouldn't learn from one to the other. Now, if you have no kasha, it's a machokus if you could learn it, if it's not extra on both ends. We've seen that machokus earlier, it's machokus or below and the chachamim. However, where you have a valid reason not to make the limud, you can't do it unless it's extra on both ends. So what are we going to do over here? It's not extra on both ends. So the Gemara says it is extra because you don't need one of these mimenus for Rabba bar Avua's drasha. You don't need it for the drasha that you're allowed to burn a tamei truma. There's a different source for that, and that's because it says ani hine nasati l'cha'as mishmeres terumos. So I'm giving you to guard my trumos. Two trumos, one is tamei, one is tahar, that you have to guard both of them, and it's calling them truma. The Gemara gives a drasha that the two of them is, one is my truma and one is your truma. That means that you're allowed, there's one that's called mine and one that's called yours. And the one that's called yours is Truma Tameya, and that you're allowed to burn, you're allowed to use it for yourself. That's Gemara's Drasha. Therefore, you have a source there that you're allowed to burn Truma Tameya. You don't need Rabbi Yevamos Drasha from Mimenu, and Mimenu is there for extra to use for this libud. Alright, this concludes the Gemara's discussion of an Orel eating Meiser. Now the Gemara starts a new topic. It refers back to the Mishnah. The second line in the Mishnah, the second word actually in the Mishnah, had said that Tamei people are not allowed to eat Truma. Gemara says, what is the source for that? Where do you see that Tamei people are not allowed to eat a Truma? So the Gemara is going to talk about 3 levels of Tumah. It's important to understand them. As we mentioned earlier, somebody who is Tamei is regular Tumah, but when he begins to purify himself, it happens in levels. First he goes to the mikvah, then he's what's called a tvul yom. He's partially tamei until the sun goes down. Then he has a more complete level of tumah. That'll be the second level. So the first is tvul yom. So besides for regular full-fledged tumah, you have a someone who just went to the mikvah. He's called a tvul yom. Once the sun goes down, for some people that's enough, and he's tahar, depending on what type of tumah he is. For some, there's a carbon that has to be brought. Carbonos are brought for a zav who saw 3 flows, not one who saw 2. For somebody who was taras muchlat, he was most definitely considered to be a mitzvah, as opposed to someone who's just locked up. And for someone who is a yoledes, someone who's tamei mace does not need a carbon. So for those who require a carbon, they're still not complete tumah. They're still not complete tahara until the carbon is brought. The carbon can't be brought till the next morning because karbanos are not brought at night. So the Gemara says we're also going to talk about 3 things as to whether they're allowed to be eaten by Tmeim or not: Meiser, Truma, and Kachim. So the Gemara's beginning question is, where do you know Truma? So the Gemara quotes Psukim. A lot of these Psukim use the word Kachim when it says not to eat Kachim. If one is Tamei, we have to figure out what type of Tumah are we referring to and what type of Kachim are we referring to. So the Gemara first quotes the pasuk which discusses the general rule that Tmeim are not allowed to eat Kachim. It says, Vaydaber. It says, Ish mizer Aaron v'utzurah izav b'kachim lo yochal ad asher yitar. So here we discuss a zav, a mitzora, and a tamei mace, and it says they cannot eat kachim. Says the Gemara, what kachim are you referring to here? It's got to be truma. Why? Because it says ish mizera Aaron. Every descendant of Aaron applies to this. Now, women can't eat karbanos. Women kohanim can't eat karbanos. So it can't be referring to karbanos. The only thing that every kohen is allowed to eat is truma. So maybe it's talking about chazav v'shok. Chazav v'shok is the parts of a karban shlamim which are given to the kohanim. Women are allowed to eat that. The Gemara says that's not true for every woman. It's only true for women who are either the daughter of a kohen never married or the wife of a kohen. However, the daughter of a kohen who married Israel and then her husband left, either divorced her or he died, and then she goes back to her father's house, she does not go back to eating chazav v'shok, and therefore they are excluded. So it's not every zerahan that applies. It says in Gemara, very funny, I'll show you a way in which truma is not eaten by every person from a kohen family. A chalala is not allowed to eat the truma. The Gemara says, no. Chalala is removed from the concept of Zera Aaron. Chalala means not a Kohen anymore. A Chalala are not Kohanim anymore. When we're talking about Kohanim, they're the only one in which they can all eat is Truma, and Chalala does not count. Okay. Now, says the Gemara, what stage of Tumah are we talking about over here? Maybe we're talking about a tvul yom. How do you know that a person who's already had nightfall and is now just what's called mechoser kippurim, just waiting for the carbon to be brought, how do you know that they can't eat truma either? That's a much lighter level of truma. Says the Gemara that can't be, because here we're talking about karbanos that don't require kippurim. They don't require karbanos. It's talking about a zav and a mitzora, and Rabbi Shmuel said it's only talking about a zav who saw twice, and the mitzora who's musgar, who's only locked up but not sent out of the camp. So therefore, it's not talking about somebody who requires Karbanos at all, and therefore it's got to be talking about a Tfil Yom. It can't be talking about a Mechusar Kippur. Oh, says the Gemara, that's great, but we still don't know what the halacha would be with somebody who is a Mechusar Kippur. Is a real Mechusar Kippur? This pasuk is not talking about it, but is a Mechusar Kippurim allowed to eat Truma or not? The Gemara is assuming that the halacha is that or not, and the Gemara says, what is the source for that? Says the Gemara, furthermore, we have a Mishnah that says that there's three levels. There's Meiser, Truma, and Kachim, and that a Tvul Yom is allowed to eat Meiser. Mechusar Kippurim is allowed to eat Truma, and Kachim can't be eaten by any of them. So the three levels match up as follows. Meiser can be eaten by anybody who had just Tvilah, a Tvul Yom. Truma can be eaten by somebody who had Tvilah and Herav Shemesh and the sunset, and it's just Mechusar Kippurim. Kachim requires all the levels. It requires Tvilah, Herav Shemesh, and Karban to be brought if it's a person who's chayav in the Karban. So the Gemara says, how do you know that Meiser requires Tvilah and that Karbanos require Kapara? So it says the Gemara, well, let's deal with this first. There are three psukim describing the tahara process. There was one that says, Lo yachol men ha'kachim ki imrachatz. He can't eat kachim until one washed. That's referring to until he does mikvah. After that, he's allowed to do. He's allowed to eat kachim horses. That's referring to meiser. There's another one that says Uba shemesh v'toher. After the sun goes down, v'achakach min ha'kachim yochal. He's allowed to eat kachim after the sun goes down. That's referring to truma. And the third one is where it says v'chipor la v'tahera. That's talking about yoledes. Only after the kapara is she considered to be tahar. So that's referring to kachim. So there you have the three levels described, and that's referring to the three things. So it says the Gemara, well, how do you know that the one that says you need to have a Herav Shemesh is talking about Truma, and the one that says you need to have only Tefillah is talking about Meiser? Maybe switch them. Says the Gemara, no. Truma is stricter than Meiser, and therefore the stricter halacha we put with Truma and not with Meiser. In what ways is Truma stricter than Meiser? So the Gemara said it has four halachos. Gemara uses the acronym Machpaz, which stand for the following: Misa, Chomesh, Ein Pidyon, and Aser Lazarim. Truma is if a non-Kohen eats it, is liable to Misa B'dei Shemayim. If he also has to pay a Chomesh, Truma is not redeemable in any way, and it has an Isser to Zarm. Meiser does not have any of those halachos, therefore Truma is stricter. Says the Gemara, well, Meiser has ways in which it is stricter. How's that? So the Gemara says, Hadas Tav, 5 halachos. It has that it's required to be brought to Yerushalayim. That's the Hey Hava. It has Vidoy Meiseris that Truma does not have. It's Aser for an Onein. That's the Samach, Aser. There are halachos of Tuma that apply to Meiser, not to Truma. It cannot be burned for use when it's Tameh, and somebody who eats it when it is Tameh doesn't get Malkas. And then there's the halacha of Biur Meisers. It has to be removed from the house at some point, which you don't have by Truma. So you have all these stringencies from Meiser as opposed to Truma. So why do they say that Truma is still more stringent than Meiser? So the Gemara says very simply, because there's one that trumps them all, and that's Misa. Somebody who eats Truma inappropriately gets Misa B'dei Shemayim. Such a halacha doesn't exist by Meiser, and therefore Meiser is still stricter. Rava says there's another limud, because the Torah says nefesh. It says nefesh asher tigabo, uses the word nefesh to describe these isurim. Nefesh refers to everybody, and nefesh is therefore the pasuk that uses the word nefesh has to be referring to something which applies to every person. The only thing that applies to every person on this list is Meiser. Meiser Sheni is relevant to Yisraelim as well. The other ones are only relevant to Kohanim, and therefore it's not going to be talking about Meiser. So the pasuk of Nefesh is talking about Meiser. That's the first pasuk. That's the one that says Lo yochel min hakachim ki imrachatz, and the second one is talking about Truma. So says the Gemara, okay, well, except for me, the second one is talking about Truma, but we still don't know that it's talking about Mechusar Kippurim. You still don't have a source for the halacha that you are claiming, that a mechusar kippurim is allowed to eat truma. This pasuk just tells me that a tefil yom cannot eat truma. You have to wait until the sun goes down. I could be talking about somebody who doesn't need to bring a carbon. What's halacha in the case of somebody who has to bring a carbon? Does he have to wait until he brings a carbon in order to be able to eat truma or not? We still don't have a source for that. Says Gemara, the source will be two psukim describing the tahara of a yoledes. That's a woman who had a child. She requires a carbon, so she is one of those who would be mechusar kippurim after the sun goes down, after her time is up. Says the Gemara, you have two psukim. One says adam belosi mei tahara, which implies once her time is up, she's tahar. And then you have another one that says v'chipur alei alkain v'tehera, she's only tahar after the carbon's brought. Says the Gemara, there's two levels of truma. One's for truma, one's for karbanos. Since karbanos we know is going to be the one that has, you have to wait until after the carbon's brought. Obviously, truma is the one that you can eat even before the carbon's brought, as soon as the sun goes down and the time is up. Says Gemara, how do you know that? Maybe switch the two. Maybe truma has to wait until the carbon's brought, and karbanos can be eaten when the sun goes down. Says the Gemara, why would you do that? It's logical that karbanos are stricter halachas. As we've seen earlier, we have the abbreviation pankachas, which is 6 halachas in which kachim are stricter: pigol, noiser, carbon, me'ila, kares, and asr for an onin. And you don't have that by truma. Says well, truma has its own halachas. It has machpaz, which we just said before, misa chomosh, no pidyon, and asr lizarim, that doesn't apply by karbanos. So it says Gemara, these are 6, that's only 4, 6 is more than 4. Rava says you don't need that from the fact that it says v'chiper aleha hakohen v'tahera implies that she was tamei before. So when we're describing the type of tuma for the yoledes, which requires the type of achila, which requires her to be after the carbon, it says that before that she was a tamei. Before that she was a tamei, that has to mean that before that she was aser on karbanos. It can't be that she was mutter on karbanos, and now this carbon that's being brought is just to permit her to eat truma. She's called a tamei at that stage. Before the carbon is brought, she's called a tamei. A tamei is always aser to eat kachim. So it can't be that it's already she's mutter to kachim, and we're just mattering her now to eat truma. It's got to be that this is mattering her to eat kachim. If that's the case, then the stage before she must have been mutter to eat truma. That's what melosi mei tahara was permitting. Says the Gemara, how could you tell me that the pasuk of melosi mei tahara is talking about permitting her to eat truma? It says in the introduction, it says dabra b'nei Yisrael, talking to b'nei Yisrael here. B'nei Yisrael don't eat truma. We even have a Mishnah, we have a Brisa that says this includes a gioris, a shifcha, and a freed shifcha, a mishachareres. So it can't be talking about truma. It's only a freed shifcha. It's talking about a b'nei Yisrael, gioris, or a shifcha mishachareres. So how can you tell me that we're talking about truma here? Truma are limited to kohanes. So says Gemara, no, not necessarily. It says b'chol kodesh lo siga, which we include truma. So obviously this refers to all people, and this pasuk is referring to kohanim separately, and it's just discussing the different halachos separately. The pasuk says b'chol kodesh lo siga. That's an halacha that applies only to a kohenes. So it's this. Pasuk is talking to everybody. Hilchas Kohen to Kohanim, to Koheneses, and Hilchas Yisrael to Yisraelis. And it's just saying each one separately, but it's all included in one phrase, and therefore you could have Kohen halachos appearing in this pasuk, and it could be talking about Truma.